Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Richard Rubin. He's the author of The Last of the Doughboys, The Forgotten Generation, and Their Forgotten World War, Confederacy of Silence, A True Tale of the New Old South, as well as scores of pieces for the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Smithsonian, among others. A fifth-generation New Yorker, he now lives in a small town in Maine, which baffles his neighbors, and you can visit him at richardrubinonline.com. The book we're talking about today is a fascinating travelogue and history of World War I. It's called Back Over There. One American time traveler, 100 years since the Great War, 500 miles of battle-scarred French countryside, and too many trenches, shells, legends, and ghosts to count. Mr. Rubin, welcome to the program.
Thank you, and sorry about that subtitle.
Well, I had to take a big gulp of air to read it all, but I think it's important because it really does describe what I think is a marvelous read. I guess the thing that baffled me the most as you were going through this rather rugged countryside in northeast France, the thing that blew me away was 100 years after World War I, there's still so much evidence in battle-scarred France of all that went on there, from craters from shells to concrete bunkers and of course unexploded duds, which really was baffling to me. I can't believe that there's still shells that might explode 100 years later.
Well, it's one of the more interesting statistics to come out of that war, and there are just so many, is that there were more shells fired during the First World War that did not explode than the total number of shells that were fired during the Second World War.
Wow.
So, and that just points to a basic truth about that war, which is that it really did much more than just sort of break all the records. It redefined war, for all of us. It was just so different and fought on such a different scale than anything, not only that had happened before that time, but that was even conceivable before that time.
I think I don't think war is ever pretty, but I think of this as one of the ugliest wars. The trenches that were dug and how they had to fight and all of that.
Well, it certainly started out as a 19th century war. Things moved very quickly. If you look at the uniforms that people wore at the beginning of the war, the Germans wore those spiked helmets known as Pickelhaube, which were really just ceremonial. They didn't provide any kind of actual protection. And the French troops famously wore bright red trousers in their early uniforms in the war. So it started out as sort of a 19th century conflict. The only thing at that point that about the war that was 20th century was the weaponry, and that's what brought the whole thing jarringly into the 20th century very quickly. And it very quickly settled down into this terribly, terribly deadly stalemate that is the war as we think of it today.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, as you describe your various locations from which you gathered more information about this history. The French countryside is rather rugged French countryside, and the roads weren't always well developed. And although you don't speak French very well, you got along all right in a part of the country where very few people spoke English.
Yes, I tell people that I speak French like a toddler. But, the thing about the French is people have this impression of haughty French cab drivers and waiters who will mock you if your French is anything less than perfect. The fact is, the French only care that you try. Mm-hmm. So if when I first started roaming around this area, my opening line was always "Parlez-vous anglais?" Do you speak English? And I quickly came to realize that nobody was ever going to say yes. They just don't speak English in these parts of France. So immediately or very quickly thereafter, I started saying, "Pardonnez-moi, mais je ne parle pas français." Forgive me, but I don't speak French. And just the fact that I said that in French, people would do anything for me, absolutely anything. they, except speak English because they can't. They don't. But they'll give you, the shirt off their back and the shirt off, the rest of their family's backs also. If you just make that 10% effort to speak a little French with them.
And another thing that happened when you talk about wanting them to speak English and they didn't, they asked if you were English. And
Yes.
when you say, no, I'm American, they warm up to you right away.
Oh, their demeanor changes very, very quickly, and it fairly quickly became apparent to me that the French don't care very much for the English, but they really do love Americans.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about traveling back through time. Various places that you went, you saw an awful lot of things that are still relics of what happened over 100 years ago.
Oh, yes. I mean, it's everywhere you go. And, when you say relics, you give the sense that they're being preserved. And they're really not. There is, if your idea of a battlefield is Gettysburg or Saratoga, you see things that people have painstakingly either preserved or restored over the past 150 or 225 years. That's not the case in France. Nothing is being preserved, or very, very little is being preserved. It just was really, really well built to begin with. It was built to last. When the Germans moved into France, they intended to keep it. Mm-hmm. And so they built all this stuff, expecting that it would need to last for a century or more. Mm-hmm. And they built so much of it that the French, after the war, just didn't have the resources and the manpower to get rid of it. Not to mention the fact that you just can't get rid of it. The Germans built things, with concrete and cement. And it's an extremely common sight in certain parts of the country to drive through, and you look to the right and you look to the left, and the fields have in the middle of them they look from a distance to be just sort of little patches of vegetation that seem out of place in the midst of a working farm field. But when you see that they're masking the remains of a concrete bunker or a pillbox, because there's just nothing the farmer can do with them. Mm-hmm. I have a friend who lives over there who enjoys history, and he knows a farmer who's got the remains of a concrete pillbox in the middle of his field, and he asked the farmer once, do you mind if I take a block from it? And the farmer said, you can take the whole thing. Because there's just nothing to be done with them. The only thing you can do is plow around them as best as you can. As I write in the book, 100 years later, the Germans are still vexing the French.
Yes, and of course they have that history with the Franco-Prussian War and then both of the World Wars. But you can still scavenge throughout this area and find cartridges and bullets and shrapnel and ID buttons and bottles and canteens and mess tins and electric insulators and keys, barbed wire, rifles, bayonets. It's amazing what's still there.
It's everything you can think of. And, sometimes it's just below the surface of the earth, and every time a farmer plows his fields, new stuff comes up. But sometimes you'll walk into a patch of woods, and as was the case when I walked into a section of forest in eastern France known as Rouge Bouquet, where an early confrontation with the Germans took place that is now remembered because the poet Joyce Kilmer wrote a poem about it. He was in that regiment. I stepped into Rouge Bouquet, and literally within 15 seconds I looked at the ground, and there was a beautiful French 1-liter bidon canteen just sitting there on top of the leaves. That had never been buried. It was literally just sitting there on top of the earth in a forest for 100 years. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of the stuff, of course, that comes up you don't want to touch, shells, trench mortars, things like that didn't go off the first time, but pardon me, just because they didn't explode when they were fired 100 years ago doesn't mean that they're not still live and not still dangerous. In fact, probably much more dangerous than they were 100 years ago because they're less stable now. But, I have to say, I found, of course, everything you can think of, but the things I found that were most meaningful to me were things like pieces of a comb or a spoon, things that were not a part of soldiers killing other soldiers, but rather soldiers trying desperately to cling to some shred of their own humanity in the most inhumane scenario you can imagine.
Mm-hmm. There are a number of recognizable names that you mention, traces that you found of, Rommel, the Desert Fox in World War II, was part of World War I as well, and MacArthur, and just some people that we don't often associate with World War I, but well known later.
Yes, and it's an interesting thing. The French don't really regard the two world wars as two separate wars. They think of them as one world war with a 20-year ceasefire in the middle. And I have to tell you that having spent a lot of time over there over the course of several years, roaming around and seeing these sites and hearing the stories and hearing about, seeing that farmhouse, Rommel, in 1914 as a 22-year-old second lieutenant stopped there for the night and demanded food and a place to sleep. And that house over there, MacArthur, in the midst of battle, stopped to regroup and figure out how he was going to manage to assault the ridge that he was trying to take. And General Patton, as a junior officer back then, and just so many other names, George Marshall. Mm-hmm. You quickly come to understand that the French are right. This really is just one conflict with a 20-year ceasefire in the middle. It was fought in the same place, very often with the exact same people who were young officers or even young enlisted men in the First World War were back fighting as senior officers or junior officers in the Second World War.
Mm-hmm. And there were even rumors that a Corporal Hitler was on the French lines at some point.
Oh, he certainly was.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I was told a story at one point by a friend of mine over there who knows a certain area very well, the area where the Second Battle of the Marne was fought. He was showing me a spot where American troops had fought, the 28th Division, which was National Guard from Pennsylvania. And he told me that they had faced off against a German unit that had Corporal Hitler in its ranks. Mm-hmm. And he said to me, what if the Americans had killed just a few more Germans there, and what if one of them had been, Adolf Hitler? History would be very different now. Mm-hmm. And, honestly, when somebody says something like that to you, at least in my case, I just don't know what to do with it. You just shake your head and wonder, and, that so much of history, in effect, could have been changed on the ground upon which you're actually standing. Mm-hmm. It almost hurts my head to think about it sometimes.
And what you said about the ceasefire between the wars, one of the things that I had to read the line 2 or 3 times in the epilogue where you said basically when they signed the armistice, they were enacting or predicting the surrender to the Nazis 22 years later.
They didn't know that, of course.
Right.
They just, the terms of the armistice were quite harsh. The French, had the Germans where they wanted them. The Germans had absolutely no leverage. And, remember that Germans had invaded France 4 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks earlier, and had killed 1 million or so French people just in uniform, and God only knows how many civilians, and had destroyed a great deal of the country, literally laid it to waste. The French were very bitter at that point, and understandably so, and they wanted to make the Germans hurt as much as they could, which was, fine in the short term, but by the terms of that armistice, I believe, that moment that armistice was signed in that railway car in a forest in northern France, that's the moment that the Second World War became inevitable.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the German sense of permanence versus how the Allied forces fought, because they built their line of defense impenetrable, and they built it because they expected to always be there. They had a lot of concrete and their trenches.
It's an amazing thing. When you're in France, almost any time you come across something that's made of concrete, especially trenches, it's German. The French were not allowed to build concrete trenches because the French were always supposed to be moving forward to push the hated Germans out of their country. And concrete implies that you plan to stick around for a while. So that was deemed bad for morale. But the Germans did plan to stick around for a while. In fact, they considered this to be Germany. The Western Front, the parts of France that they took in 1914, they regarded that as Germany. That was going to be Germany henceforth and forever. And so they built very, very elaborate and intricately designed defense works out of concrete. And they really overbuilt them. I'm from New York, and people like to say that the Empire State Building was overbuilt. That you couldn't build a building that way today. And the Germans really overbuilt their defenses. I mean, perhaps in wartime there is no such notion as overbuilding, but these were defenses that were not designed on the fly. The Germans planned and planned and planned again this war well before the first shot was fired. They had spies roaming the French countryside for decades, plotting out battlefields, figuring out what positions they wanted. And you can tell anytime you go to a battlefield, you can tell what the German position was. Just look around and ask yourself, where would I rather be? And that's exactly where the Germans were. Mm-hmm. They just they planned that war down to the tiniest detail, and they went in and they built and they built and they built. Everything they had, they trucked in from Germany, or they moved in by trains, all their concrete. Everywhere the Germans went, they electrified. And they trucked in massive diesel generators to electrify everything. I mean, this was, this was Germany. And the best evidence I can give you of that is that in every German military cemetery, or almost every German military cemetery from the First World War that you'll ever visit in France, there are your standard government-issued markers. But there are also individual personal memorials that were commissioned either by the family of the fallen or by the fallen's own comrades in arms. And some of them are quite beautiful and very moving. And they were made back in Germany by stonemasons and then shipped to France and installed in these cemeteries. And they're there to this day. Well, you don't do that in a cemetery, in a land that you don't think you're going to be able to freely visit forever. These people regarded this conquered territory as Germany, and they felt that these cemeteries were on German soil, and that the loved ones of these fallen soldiers would want to come in future years and future generations and visit these grave sites.
Mm-hmm. And in the early part of the war, we have to remember that the U.S. entered, late into the war. In fact, I remember seeing a campaign sign from Woodrow Wilson's 1916 campaign that said he kept us out of war.
I'm going to have to take issue just with your use of the term late.
Okay.
And don't feel badly. I do this with anybody. My question for you is, late for what? Neither you nor I might exist if the United States had entered the First World War in 1914.
Well, let's talk about that 1914, because the French were in free fall, and there's the famous Great Retreat. Mm-hmm. And the Marne is a place where they were able to take a stand with the British. By their view, it would probably be considered late because they were just losing.
That's right, but the British and the French both had empires that they could call upon to come to their aid. The British had Indian troops and Australian troops, New Zealand troops, and on and on. And the French had a great many troops from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Indochina, this and that. But the United States, of course, had no formal affiliation with either France or England at that time, and really had no interest in getting in the war. In fact, public opinion in this country ran very strongly against getting involved in the First World War. Mm-hmm. And so, and Woodrow Wilson, as you said, got reelected in 1916, running on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." That was the popular choice in this country. In fact, great many Americans thank their lucky stars that we had an ocean protecting us. Mm-hmm. From all of this carnage. And as I said, as the grandson of a World War I veteran, I might very well not exist if America had entered the war in 1914, because I had no reason to believe that he would have survived another 32 months of that war. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, the British and French did, I'm sure, would very much have appreciated if we had entered that war in 1914, but I think it's very, very hard to make a case that it was in American self-interest to do so.
Right, and I just want to say I share that in common with you. I'm the grandson of a World War I veteran. He was served in the artillery, Tennessee Guard that was called up, and he was gassed in the trenches and had a lot of recovery time when he got back to the States. But and let's just paint a picture of how ugly trench warfare is. I mean, the Germans had concrete trenches and even drainage. The Allies were not so lucky. They had dirt trenches and very little drainage, which meant and very few latrines, which meant that there was often human waste floating in the floods when the rains were heavy.
There was, when you see movies of World War I, if they're good. I'm not even going to talk about Downton Abbey. If you've seen Downton Abbey and you know what the trenches in that show looked like, I mean that was basically a rumpus room compared to what real trenches were like. But a good movie will show you that a trench was muddy and wet and dirty, but even they won't show you that trenches were often filled with human waste. They were dug. They were dug, very quickly under very trying circumstances. In Allied trenches, at least, typically no thought was given to sanitation or drainage. At least with German trenches, German concrete trenches, you see, they often had drainage ditches built into them, and so they were, again, if you'd ask yourself where would I rather be, it's almost always the German position. But trenches were just a terrible place to be, and General Pershing, to his credit, I believe, wanted nothing to do with trench warfare. He paid very close attention to what was going on in Europe from 1914 on, and he made the decision that Americans weren't going to fight that kind of war. And the first part of that decision was that he decided that Americans were not going to be used as replacement troops in British and French units. They were going to fight together as American units, and whenever possible under entirely American command. So he was very dedicated to learning the lessons of that war and did not want Americans to fight in the trenches. And, certainly later on in the war, starting at the beginning of the fall of 1918, they did not. It was a very different kind of war, a war that moved much more quickly than, the slogged stalemate that had characterized the war up till that point.
Mm-hmm. And that's an important milestone is when the Americans, led by American commanders, begin to take hold in places that were just static before that. I mean, you talk about the superiority of German intelligence and the durability of the structures they built, and even when the French entered the war, they were playing by these old rules. You didn't use machine guns on the front line offensively, and but at some point they realized the Germans weren't going to play by those rules, and it just seems to me amazing that they held out long enough for the hundreds of thousands of doughboys to arrive and save them.
Well, that's really the remarkable thing. And, you hear a lot about and read a lot about the First World War. And frankly, if you're American and speak only English and read only books written in the English language, I think it's easy to come away with the impression that that war was fought entirely by British soldiers. But it's really the French who won that war with our help. And they couldn't have done it without our help. But, we didn't get into the war until April of 1917 and really didn't start showing up on the front until the fall of 1917, and then only in very small numbers. You walk around France, like I did. You walk around the Western Front and see what the Germans built, and you hear stories about what they brought. And you just have to ask yourself, how did they lose that war? They had such an advantage. And yet the French, who, had a very, very rough 1914. It took them, it seems, a long time to figure out, what they were up against. And to not, you hear stories, absolutely true stories, of French soldiers lining up in the fall of 1914 and marching into German machine gun fire while a band behind them plays the Marseillaise. I mean, this is what their 1914 was like. But at a certain point, they figured things out, and they managed to hang on, long enough for the Americans to show up in force and tip the balance. I don't think they get nearly enough credit. People talk about the French, and they talk about them in World War II and how the French capitulated after 6 weeks of war. I can't fault them at all. If you know what they went through just 20 years earlier, and you know what they endured, and they absolutely refused to surrender, they deserve all the credit in the world, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it was really the French who won that war. And the Germans tried everything they could think of. It's not like they didn't change their tactics after 1914 either. The greatest battle of World War I is the Battle of Verdun, which lasted for 10 and a half months in 1916. And the whole purpose of that battle was for the Germans, as they put it, to bleed France white. And they very nearly succeeded. And still, the French hung on for 2 whole years after that.
I remember one of your tour guides, when you asked them how could the Germans possibly have lost, and the answer was the Americans.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
And first of all, it's true. And second of all, I mentioned earlier that, based on my experiences at least, the French don't much care for the English, but they love Americans. That's why.
Yeah.
It goes back 100 years, because even though Americans have forgotten the tremendous transformative role that we played in the First World War, and frankly, by extension, in the course of world history to this day, even though we Americans have forgotten what we did, the French have never forgotten it. And they have never ceased being grateful, tremendously grateful for it. I had people over there treat me as if I were part of the American Expeditionary Forces. They said to me, we will never forget what you did for us.
Wow.
100 years later, these are people with no living memory of the war, but they care deeply about history, and they're eternally grateful to the United States for the fact. I mean, if you think about it, this is the first time in human history when a nation crossed an ocean to fight not for land, not for treasure or empire, but solely for the freedom, for the liberty of another nation.
Oh, that's a fabulous epilogue to our interview, which is just about, our time is just about done. We didn't even touch on the subterranean chalk mines and how well developed they were. This is such a fascinating read, Mr. Rubin. The book is Back Over There, and it's a marvelous travelogue and history of the Great War, the war to end all wars. It's a great read. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you that if you don't hear our regularly scheduled broadcast, you can also catch up with us on YouTube at Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. Thanks for listening, and make it a great day.